So very good. We started recording. So welcome everybody to this seminar series of complex systems. So as you have seen in this seminar series, we have a standard list of speakers, and they put me in a very difficult position, that having to introduce such a stellar guest. So I will try to summarize the work done by our speaker today, James Sethna. First, let me mention a bit about his education. Jim studied the BA in physics at Harvard University in 1977. Then he did his MA in physics at Princeton University and also his PhD in physics at Princeton University, where he finished his PhD at 1981. Then he did several postdoc fellowships, first at Cornell University from 82 to 83, then at the Institute for Theoretical Physics at UCSB, which is University of California, Santa Barbara, first from 81 to 82, and then from 83 to 84. Jim Sethna has made substantive contributions to many fields, from glasses to spin glasses, dynamical systems and chaos, liquid crystals, crackling noise, plasticity, fracture, information theory, and the normalization group. He's the author of a fantastic book, which I adore, which is called Statistical Mechanics, Entropy, Order Parameters, and Complexity, a textbook which, according to Jim, is a distillation of the most generally useful ideas on the subject matter. And he's currently professor of physics at Cornell University. So Jim, thank you very much virtually to Mexico City, to Iztapalapa. Welcome to Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana. It's a great honor to have you among us. So please go ahead and start your seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to tell you about something today that is somewhat of a departure from traditional physics at the beginning and will return towards the end to things more directly related to physics. This is a work that I've done with a number of really talented graduate students and colleagues and postdocs and over the last 15 years. And I'll start, the talk will be sort of broken up into three pieces. The first piece is to outline what the questions are. And they have to do with multi-parameter models fit to data. And the fact that there are lots of parameters lead the models to being very, what's called ill-posed, that you can't extract the parameters of the model from the behavior of the model. And I'll characterize that by eigenvalues of a certain Hessian matrix, something like chi-squared, and I'll try to convince you that sloppiness is also a feature of physics, which is really underlying the whole idea of emergence, that you have emergent theories that don't depend upon the microscopic details, but that this same phenomenon happens in all of science where they don't have small parameters. I'll then explain the sloppiness using differential geometry. So instead of talking about parameter space, I'll talk about the space of predictions. And that space of predictions, I'll give a geometrical characterization of that space as what we call a hyperribbon, and then explain how the hyperribbon motivates and explains the unusual behavior we saw in parameter space. Then finally, I'll return to statistical mechanics, to physics, and do two things. One thing is model reduction, trying to explain why you can take a complicated model and make it simpler, and the systematic way of doing it that was not discovered by me, but by Mark Transtrom here. And secondly, a new method of model visualization, looking at a high dimensional space of predictions in a low dimensional projection. I welcome questions at any point. So there are two basic broad theoretical things that physicists like to do. One is to start out with a microscopic theory and make controlled approximations and use small parameters to extract new theories. And a good example of this in condensed matter physics is how we start with Schrodinger's equation and derive theories of liquids, theories of metals, theories of topological insulators, theories of magnets, and we do so often as a fairly systematic a series of approximations. In high energy physics, it's an almost identical set of basic techniques where the new theories for nuclear physics and quantum electrodynamics and Schrodinger's equation are a reduction of old theories where renormalizability guarantees that the nature of quantum electrodynamics does not depend upon the details of the electroweak interaction in the same way that our theories of liquids do not depend upon exactly what atoms and molecules are composing the liquid. The other technique that physicists like to do is make up theories that they think capture the essence of a problem. So the early theories of superconductors and superfluids were made up by Landau without any microscopic knowledge. He just wrote down a theory and said this works. And our theories of flocking of birds does not start out with the psychology of birds or even aerodynamics. It's made up trying to get the key instruments, sort of the spherical cow picture or Occam's razor. And so we have reductionism and synthesis, and I'd like to say that what we're trying to do is take these ideas from physics and try to understand, use them to understand what happens in other sciences and how they work and connect the two. Any questions so far before I plunge into the phenomenon of sloppiness in parameter space?
Any questions, colleagues? If you have any questions, just simply unmute your microphone and go ahead. Or if you have some technical reason, maybe you can write it on the chat and I can read it. If not,
okay,
let's continue.
We'll have others. So we started out in this subject when a couple of my graduate students dragged me in to have discussions with Rick Sirione, a cancer biologist, about pathways inside cells. And at some point, Rick took us and said, here's the diagram for one of the best known signal transduction pathways in cells, where there are two hormones and they trigger two different kinds of cell behavior, and they both use the same central pathway, but they have these side branches. And we said, well, we can't implement a theory that's just arrows and boxes. And he said, oh, well, these are the equations. And he basically wrote all these equations out for us. He had a chemical engineering background, and he said, you know, the biologists that I hire, they don't want to do these equations. They don't want to simulate them. They don't want to, and we need to do that to really understand what's going on. And I was kind of skeptical. I was saying, boy, there are a lot of parameters in these equations. There are 48 parameters. So here's one equation in that list. It's a nonlinear differential equation. It doesn't look like chemical reactions, but it is in fact a simplification of a larger series of regular chemical reactions into what are called Michaelis-Menten formulas. And already you can see a hint of the sloppiness that the individual reactions didn't matter. All that mattered were the effective degrees of freedom, assuming one of the enzymes was in short supply. But anyway, we have 6 parameters here. We have 48 parameters. It was going to be, I said you would be able to fit all the data no matter what, because there's so much flexibility. And that you'd never be able to figure out those parameters from any kind of experiment. So I was right and I was wrong. That here's we got a 48 parameter fit to the data. We found the errors in the parameters, and I was completely right. You couldn't determine any of the parameters. In fact, it was remarkable. The best determined parameter had an error bar of 5,000%, a factor of 50. And they got worse from there. Okay, we did an ensemble of parameters, and they all fit the data. Then we tried to make it a prediction. I said you could make a prediction that'll be wrong. You could take the same model and fit it again. You got so much flexibility. I was wrong about that. Here is the set of predictions for this parameter set, with these numbers changing by factors of 1,000,000 to 50. And here is a prediction for a new experiment, which we actually did. Rick Sarion predicted that when we did this experiment, that I believe this red curve would look like the blue curve, but it didn't. It stayed red, just as our theory predicted. Now, what's amazing here is not that we could write down a theory that made correct predictions. It's not even that we could write down a theory that made correct predictions that the expert thought would not happen. The amazing thing is that we got 20% error bars here. We had all our parameters were off by at least a factor of 50, but we have only 20% errors in our predictions. We deduced in the end that the problem was that there were some parameter combinations that were really important, and they were well constrained. And it was only the remaining parameter combinations that were causing all of the error in the bare parameters. And so here we have a contour plot of a similar model, not the same one, in which this direction is stiff. These contours are contours of chi-squared, or goodness of fit, the sum of the squares of the errors between the model and the data divided by the error bars. Some of the directions are stiff, some of them are sloppy. The bare parameters are not aligned, so all the parameters are uncertain because of the sloppy directions. There are no parameters that are purely along stiff directions. And what you probably haven't noticed is that the axes here are different. If I was showing this in person, this axis would be about 1 meter high, and this axis would have to be 1 kilometer in order to be the same scale. That these sloppy directions are much less well determined than the stiff ones. This is what is known in the field as the ill-conditioned systems. There are only a few stiff parameters that matter very much in the behavior. And I'm going to come again to talk about the eigenvalues of the quadratic form near the best fit. And those eigenvalues are the eigenvalues of the second derivative of this cost matrix. And that's going to turn into our metric tensor when we go into the differential geometry.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Could you please repeat what you're plotting in the level curve plot? I didn't understand. What is like the
So the theory predicts a given curve for each of these chemical species, and that's y sub theta. Theta are the parameters, and at time t you can compare it with the experimental data, and the experimental data has an error bar, and that sum is just the least squares error, and its second derivative with respect to theta, as I change the parameters, tells you how well you know those parameters. If you move in a direction theta that changes the predictions a lot, then the cost will go up quickly. And if you take a combination of parameters that don't change the predictions that you're measuring, then it's sloppy. Excellent question.
Yeah, can I have a couple of questions, Jim? The first one is the following. If knowing that these models have this property of sloppiness, is just inherent of the model, or it depends on the type of data that you have? So if
yes.
if you were God and you could say, if I measure in this way, I'm going to reduce my uncertainty and the parameters. Is that possible? And
Yes.
the second question would be, can you identify them which are the most important parameters and focus all the data on those parameters? Because if the other ones are not important, you can just very well throw it randomly.
Yeah, okay. So all the parameters are important. Only a few parameter combinations are important. Okay? So you might think all I have to do is rotate until I find those parameter combinations, call them our parameters, and then it doesn't matter. But it's not quite that simple, but we'll talk much more about that. Any parameter, any of these red arrows, if I move it, it screws up the behavior. But if I move with a little bit of this and a little bit of this and a little bit of that, so I move in this direction, then it works. Then it's sloppy. And the other question you asked, I could certainly take this same system and design new sets of experiments that measure each reaction constant separately. And actually, Rick Sarion was telling us that I could do those measurements in the test tube, but I couldn't pay anybody enough to do them. And if they did them, they'd get an answer that would be wrong by a factor of 4 or 5, because the behavior in the system is different from the behavior separately. Which is to say that there are lots of things wrong with your model in principle, that they don't include all the other things that are going on in the cell. But you're correct that the sloppiness does have something to do with the statement you're trying to make predictions about the collective behavior, not. So, for example, perfectly good prediction you could have is what are the parameters, and those are very badly predicted. So this is not particular to biology. There are lots of different kinds of systems that we study that have sloppiness. I like to talk about quantum chemistry, where there's quantum Monte Carlo, which has a variational wave function that a colleague of mine, Cyrus Umrigar, lent us, and we found that its predictions were sloppy when you looked at the variables that he put in as a wave function. Cosmic microwave background radiation has a sloppy spectrum. The Ising model has a sloppy spectrum. These are things I'll talk about later on in the talk. There was a grad student of one of my former students who was studying meat oxidation in Denmark, and that had a sloppy spectrum. This is the model of accelerators in one of my colleagues' model. We actually use our sloppy model methods to try to tune the accelerator to get a better beam, making use of the fact that most of the degrees of freedom don't matter. Here's a bunch of other experiments: circadian rhythms, van der Pol oscillators, neural networks, Hodgkin-Huxley model of neuroscience, bunch of work on power systems by Mark Transtrom's group. Now, some of these models, the Ising model in particular, and the cosmic microwave background radiation, aren't least squares models. So I've been talking about the cost Hessian. I've been talking about the second derivative matrix of the cost with respect to the parameters. That only works for very special kinds of models. If you don't have Gaussian errors, for example, that wouldn't be the right way to compare things. And more generally in physics, we can think of a model as something that produces a probability distribution for the predictions, and any such probability distribution has a metric tensor given by the Fisher information metric, which happens to give the cost Hessian for least squares models. And so when I talk about the Ising model, I will talk about its metric tensor, and it's given by this nice clear formula in terms of the space of predictions of all possible spin configurations, for example. Okay, so here's the Ising model, and here are the eigenvalues of the Fisher information metric, and I'm trying to connect here between sloppy model methods and renormalization group methods that you would use to describe the behavior near the critical point. So here's a snapshot of the Ising model, and if you look at each of the spin configurations and its probability, you can basically measure all the parameters. So the parameters here would be nearest neighbor interaction, next neighbor interaction, third neighbor interactions. We would just add a whole bunch of possible interactions, and then we found very clever ways of measuring the derivative of the answer with respect to adding a strength of a bond, and did simulations and measured all those things, and we got these eigenvalues, and they're not very well spread out. There's a little bit of a gap here, but really, from the sloppy spectrum, when we had 6, 8 orders of magnitude that I showed you, typically 12 orders of magnitude before rounding errors started keeping you from measuring things suitably. This is not sloppy. However, we know that the Ising model becomes universal under coarse graining. And so Ben and Ricky and Mark figured out how to calculate Fisher information matrices for coarse grain systems. And this is sneaky and clever, and they found when you coarse grained, you got much broader distributions, clearly leading to universality. What's more, the stiff combinations turned out to be physically reasonable. One was the external field, and one was the change in the transition temperature. The combination of parameters that control the transition temperature was a relevant parameter, which is just what Ken Wilson would say. The T minus TC is relevant, and the external field is relevant. So I would claim, we also did the same thing for a diffusion model where we had long-range hops in one dimension, and so continuum limits, which is 19th century physics, and renormalization group, which is late 20th century physics, both at root are sloppy. I'm not saying you can use information geometry and sloppiness to deduce Ken Wilson's emergent scale invariant predictions. There's no power laws, there's no universal scaling functions in this analysis, but we can definitely tell you that there is a behavior that doesn't depend on all those other parameter combinations, only depends on the things that Ken Wilson would tell you were important. Doesn't tell you what kind of theory you get, but it does tell you that there is an emergent theory. Okay, so now I'm going to plunge into differential geometry. If people have questions, this would be a good break.
I have a, sorry.
Go ahead, Rafael, please.
So sorry, maybe I missed it, but you mentioned that when you do this coarse graining approach, you see some universality in the sloppiness. Can you please explain that a little bit?
So what I'm saying is when I coarse grain, it becomes sloppier, and sloppiness is a symptom of most of the microscopic parameters being unimportant. That there are only two combinations of parameters here that determine the behavior.
Okay, so I don't know, like if you were, sorry, so if you were going to do this in, let's say, in a vapor liquid, which is the same universality class, you would see a similar behavior if you discourse.
You would see two emergent. You would be led to believe that there was a theory for the Ising model which only had two parameters you need to know. And those two parameters, this method gives you some indication of what microscopic parameters lead to these two parameters. But really the key question is, how many parameters did you need? Universality, I don't think I can give you. All I can say is this model is sloppy, and therefore there's a simpler emergent description. And liquid gas is sloppy, and it has a simple emergent description. Making them connect is something that you need Ken Wilson's insight as fixed points in coarse graining.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good. So I apologize. I was just talking to Isaac earlier that this graph disappeared. So this is the model manifold, and then this was supposed to be the parameter space graph. And there were long ellipses here, taking this simple model and giving you the errors with the best fit here. So if you imagine a bunch of elliptical contours, this model is the sum of two exponentials. Obviously, it's not a multi-parameter model, it's a two-parameter model, but I did it because I wanted model manifold to be a two-dimensional manifold in a three-dimensional space. So the two coordinates on the model manifold are the two parameters, and the three dimensions of the model manifold are the three predictions, y1, y2, and y3 at 3 time points. And if I plot the possible predictions, I get this surface. Now, this surface has a few features. One feature is it has boundaries. Theta is allowed to vary from 0 to infinity, but when it's 0, you just get a constant from that term. And when it's infinity, it just drops to 0 after the first instant. And in either case, you get a finite prediction. This is characteristic of many of these multi-parameter models, that they saturate. They're non-linear models, so they saturate when they hit a boundary. Another statement is that the parameters are the coordinates on this manifold. And the metric tensor, which is a distance in data space, induces the metric G mu nu, the Fisher information metric that we've been using in parameter space. So the model boundaries will turn out to be very important for us. There's one more model boundary in this particular model when theta1 is equal to theta2. So you should think of this triangle as a square, the original square over here, warped and folded over because of that symmetry. The model boundaries will become very important for model reduction later on. And the other thing is I'm going to explain sloppiness by thinking about taking data points like measuring y2. If I measure the y2 and I find it's at a particular value, I would slice this model manifold along that value of y2, and that would give me the model manifold of the predictions compatible with having a particular measurement. The claim we have is that the first statement is the model manifold empirically is a hyperribbon, and then I'll go on to say why it's a hyperribbon. What is a hyperribbon? Hypercube is a high-dimensional cube. Hypersphere is a high-dimensional sphere. Hyperribbon is a manifold that's longer than it is wide and wider than it is thin, and so on and so on and so on. And one thing that always confuses people is that there were thin directions in parameter space corresponding to the stiff directions. Here, the thin directions are correspond to the sloppy degrees of freedom. The sloppy degree of freedom is a way that you can move a long distance without changing the behavior. And this is behavior space. So the stiff direction is the one that moves you along the long axis of the hyperribbon, and a sloppy direction is one that moves you along a very thin direction. And the fact that the models saturate, that you can move all the way to infinity in parameter space and not go in the infinite distance in behavior is what makes it possible to have sloppy directions all correspond to thin ones. Last thing, this graph is really a convincing statement that if I take a point where it is the best fit and I move along a stiff direction with eigenvalue lambda, I have a width that's bigger than the ones where I go move along a sloppy direction. And these widths almost perfectly scale with square root of the eigenvalue. Just as you would expect if that the square root of the eigenvalue tells you the long axis of the hyperribbon, and not of the ellipsoid in parameter space, so it makes sense. Okay. Now that was a great insight, and we then spent some more years messing around, and then finally we found a rigorous bound on the model manifold. We found a way of turning this qualitative picture of hyperribbons into a calculation. The rigor has been added by Catherine Quinn, who was a student of mine, and Heather Wilbur and Alex Townsend, who were two mathematicians here at Cornell. And they use the smoothness of model predictions on the experimental conditions, not on parameter space. The model doesn't have to be differentiable in parameter space. It has to be differentiable and smooth and have a radius of convergence in like time in the old problem, in the temperature that you ran the experiment, in things that you would change from one experiment data point to another. And I'm going to give you a qualitative argument for why you get a hyperribbon here. And I like the argument, but it's a little subtle. And the key statement, though, is when I'm done, if I take an experiment and I know that the behavior is smooth with time, and I turn that into a formal statement, then I can guarantee that no matter what model it is, as long as its dependence on time is smooth, it has to have predictions inside this hyperellipsoid, and that the actual behavior, this blue slab here is the actual behavior of the model in this particular three-dimensional ellipsoid I'm spinning around. That the actual behavior actually scales about the right way, as you would expect from the hyperellipsoid. Okay, so what's my argument for the hyperrhythm? It's kind of cool. It's a little subtle, and it has to do with interpolation theory. So interpolation theory tells you that if you have a bound on the nth derivative of a function, remember I was telling you the function had to be smooth, and if I have measurements at a bunch of points, that the error in the truncated model, the error in the deviation of the behavior from a polynomial fit to these points will always be less than this polynomial. So, for example, if I took another measurement, so if I have measurements at these 4 points, the total error could possibly be is this much if the fifth derivative is bounded. Now, if you look at this, these delta t's, if I just call t minus t1 the whole range of times delta t, and if I look at this formula, it turns out to be if that is bounded by r, that's the radius of convergence. So I'm going to call this r to the m. So this is delta t to the m over r to the m. Each time I add a new point, all the predictions get better by a factor of delta t over r. Now, what does that have to do with my model manifold? Well, I mentioned that if I make a data point here, if I measure a data point here, it slices the model manifold. So every time I slice the model manifold along some axis, it becomes thinner in all directions, all the remaining directions, by a factor of delta t over r. So the fact that each parameter was a factor of 3, each time my sloppy parameters were spaced logarithmically, something like a factor of 3 apart, that means the model manifold's thicknesses were square root of 3 apart, which would be explained if the radius of convergence of my theory was 3 times bigger than the square root of 3 times bigger than the separation of time points. So I'm hoping you got a little bit of a spirit of that calculation. Mark Transtrom and Ben Maxta put together this argument, and then it was turned into a rigorous argument which uses Chebyshev polynomials and real algebra, deep knowledge of linear algebra, and the bound. There's a rigorous but not very elegant bound in terms of eigenvalues of the van der Waals matrix, which is this black curve. There's a rigorous, beautiful bound which is not quite as tight, which tells you that the eigenvalues of the black curve are bounded by a power law. This is a log-log plot, and no, log linear plot, where this is the eigenvalue, and then these are the eigenvalues for 3 different classes of models where we made measurements at the same times. One was a epidemiology model, one was a chemical, very simple chemical reaction model, and one the sums of exponentials, which I pretend is a physics model, so physics, chemistry, and biology.
Can I ask a couple of questions? Well, actually, one I was going to mention, but you already put there. So the theory that you showed in the previous slide is just the Edward formula from Taylor theorem, right? And actually, indeed, you can use Chebyshev polynomials to have a tighter bound, which is what you do in the next slide. Now, my question is more regarding what is the role that plays the cost function in all this analysis. So let me put it. Let me give you a concrete example. Normally, when you have the probability distribution of the model, so you may assume that this has a Gaussian form. But suppose that I use, which is a Euclidean measure, but suppose I use a different type of measure, for instance, L1 measure or other type of measure. How does this analysis changes if I change the measure that appears in the probability distribution? Because intuitively, one might think that a different measure will try to capture more fine properties of the data or of the model.
So the Fisher information metric is defined for any kind of probability distribution. We've never used it to talk about L1 versus L2, but in principle, you can take it over and use it there. What we have done is used it for things like the Ising model, where the probability distribution is not Gaussian, is not L1, it's just given the temperature and given the field, it gives a probability for each spin configuration. And for that, it's very valuable. And then our model for the early universe looks like a multidimensional Gaussian, but it's got the probability distribution is a multidimensional Gaussian whose properties depend upon what parameters you use for the universe. So it's again the nonlinear problem, but not sort of changing from Gaussian to non-Gaussian, but having the Gaussians not be constant with parameters.
Thank you.
Other questions? This is the time to stop me before I plunge into statistical mechanics.
Please, yes, colleagues, any questions? Please go ahead and mute your microphones and ask directly, or just write it on the chat and I'll read it. If not, let's continue.
Okay. So you remember there was reductionism and spherical cows. And I'm going to start out with reductionism. Reductionism is you're trying to understand what the new model is that's simpler and understand why your simple model has almost the same explanatory power as the original one. This is related to the question of finding low dimensional representations of high dimensional data. That the machine learning people always have this problem. They've got, pictures are a gigantic long vector in pixel intensities, and they want to understand picture space by starting with those long vectors and doing some process to separate the cats from the dogs from the automobile steering wheels. And we're not doing that for picture space, but we're doing this in a sense for multi-dimensional, multi-parameter model space. We're going to take this model manifold and we're going to try to find low dimensional pictures of it and say, if my theory with 48 parameters predicts something that really looks like a three-dimensional surface, then maybe there's a three-dimensional model out there. Maybe it explains why things are simple. So we started out by looking at the, I'm going to flip around here, at the microwave background radiation. And Catherine Quinn, I said, this is a model with, 7 or 8 parameters, but they can measure all of them. Is it because it's not sloppy? They figured out how to write their theories so that the individual parameters can be measured, or is it sloppy? And she almost immediately came back with help from our collaborators in astrophysics and said it's sloppy, that I found the Fisher information metric at the best fit to our universe, and it has eigenvalues that are spread out over many decades. And they just have fantastic data, which allow them to specify all the parameters, even though it's sloppy. All right. And then I said, let's draw the model manifold. And months went by. And I would say, well, why don't we just do the model manifold for the correlation function? And she would say, but she would convince me that that was not faithful to the metric. It's not isometric. It's not the distance in that space. When I look at the points on the correlation function, doesn't correspond to the distance and probability distributions. And finally, I thought one of my other students came up with remembered something that he saw on the web, that if you take a probability distribution and you take its square root, you get something called the Hellinger distance, which is which satisfies the statement that if you take 2 vectors square root of p and take their difference and square it, that gives you the Fisher information metric locally. Let me say that again. The square root of p is a unit vector. It's a point on this hypersphere, and that's an isometric convection. So we tried that, and we got horrible pictures. They all look like this. I'm going to explain. This came from the Ising model, but it looks like this. That almost all the points were in one spot. And we realized that what was happening was that we got an isometric embedding. That was a perfectly good manifold for the space of all possible universes. I moved the parameters around in the universe, but that space of all possible universes was not low dimensional, or it could be looked at in a low dimensional way. It was a 7-dimensional manifold, but the manifold was so warped that it wouldn't even be fit in 7 dimensions. It took giant numbers of dimensions to look at it. And Catherine pointed out that her manifold would look much better if she had less data. If instead of measuring all these instead of measuring all this fine-grained data, she only took a few moments, she would get a perfectly nice picture. And so we went to the 2x2 Ising model, and we got a nice model manifold, and went to the 4x4 Ising model, and we got a slightly warped manifold. And it was clear that the higher the dimension, the more it warped. But unfortunately, we couldn't do any more than 4x4 because we ran out of computer time, because you had to do exact calculations of all the probabilities. So we realized that if we took 4 snapshots of the 2x2 Ising model, like this, we got the same kind of picture. That this was, as we add more data, and we can add more data either by doing a bigger model or by doing more snapshots of the small model, we got more curvature here. And sure enough, if we do enough of these to make up 128 squared, we got the dust that we were having in the early universe. I mean, in the microwave background radiation. So we can talk about that a lot, but the dust settles. What we did then was replica theory. We can think of this as 4 replicas of my original 2x2 model. You take n replicas, and then you take the limit n to 0, and that's how the spin glass people solve their problems. And when we did it, we found using all the data from whatever model you have, you can take the limit of 0 data, and then you get a model manifold of low dimensions. And that gave us this is a model manifold for a neural network that's learning digits, and at the beginning it's not learned them, and at the end it nicely separates all the digits. This is the Ising model I was telling you about. This is the space of all possible universes. It looks great. It's got one subtlety, that it's an isometric embedding into Minkowski space. There are negative directions here. But other than that, it's great. And you can take a complicated model and you can see how simple it really is by doing this. So now, the Ising model, it was frustrating that we could only do a 4x4 Ising model. And then Han King was playing around with the suggestion that maybe instead of using the Bhattacharya embedding, which is the limit of 0 data in replica theory, we use the Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is a famous common thing in statistics. We can do the same game. And then he found explicit formulas for the coordinates, and it was embedded in a finite dimensional space. I've been talking all along about how sloppy models, the higher and higher dimensions become less and less important. Well, here in probabilistic models of a certain class that includes most of statistical mechanics, called exponential families, if you have n parameters, you only have 2n eigenvalues and then it stops. If you have n parameters, you can embed it in a 2n dimensional Minkowski space. So here's the Ising model. Here's the critical point. Here's the jump-in magnetization across the critical point. These are light-like directions. It turns out it's just bizarre that the plus m, the minus m points, the Fisher information difference between them is 0. But using the Minkowski embedding, it physically separates them along a light-like direction. Very nice. So let me finish.
Jim, do you have some intuition as to why this Minkowski measure appears in this case? Has to so let me look over it. Maybe the time has to do with the fact it's related to some kind of dynamical time, but which is related to the dynamical properties of the system. It appears Minkowski because if you are to the critical point, maybe you have the critical exponent.
No, the same thing happens at fitting Gaussians to height distributions and things like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, the family is much bigger than anything having to do with physics. What I think it is the data scientists have long recognized that there was something weird about the space that they were working in, and they've been trying to use curved spaces so that they could fit their data without having them be high dimensional. And you can make a very clean argument that even least squares models done on this hypersphere given by square root of p are high dimensional. And the problem is that in Euclidean space, there's a triangle inequality, that if you have 3 models and good data, if you have n models with good data, so you really, really know that their probability distributions are completely orthogonal to one another, then they end up on orthogonal points on a sphere. Each one needs a new dimension. And that's the fundamental problem. And Minkowski space gets rid of that triangle inequality and allows them to flatten out. So I'm going to finish by a project of Mark Transtrom's. Mark Transtrom did most of that information geometry work before he left. And after leaving, he came up with this very cool thing where it's an algorithm for simplifying models. That we saw earlier that if you go to the edge of the model manifold, you get one less parameter. This corresponds to some parameter combination going to infinity. So when Mark was doing our systems biology model, he could take a geodesic to measure the width in some direction. And when he got near the edge, he saw instead of a very complicated eigendirection in the sloppy direction he was going, it suddenly became very focused with only a couple of parameters being involved in the trajectory. And that's a statement that if you take like a forward and backward reaction rate for the same reaction, if they both go to infinity, that just means that reaction is always in local equilibrium. And so you can remove it from the problem. Those two infinities you remove from the problem and just say the concentration of this is this factor times the concentration of that. And so he could take his model and find the thinnest direction and go in one direction and hit the boundary, and then he could do it again. He could take the next thinnest direction, go to the edge, and you get a codimension 2 parameters smaller. And he did that for a 48 parameter model 36 times, and he got a 12 parameter model. And this 12 parameter model, it started out with this gigantic range of eigenvalues and ended up with this nice, tiny, small range of eigenvalues. And it fit the original data almost as well. So this is Occam's razor, if you like. This is the emergent description. So remember this model. This is the model he worked on. And after he finished, lots of equations, lots of eigenvalues, complicated structure. Here's the new one. The complicated structure, you remember, had a central pathway and a side loop from here and a side loop from here and a negative feedback loop. This is what Rick Serione pointed out to us. It looks complicated, but really this is what's going on. It simplified it. And it removed this side loop that turned out to be irrelevant. It's cool. What's more, it's no longer as sloppy, pretty much not sloppy. And each of the equations here is in terms of parameters, which are explicit functions of the original parameters. Usually black boxes, you say, oh, there's a whole section of that work, I'm just going to call it blah, and the measured values of the parameters are bleak. And the physician or the biologist wants to say, but if I dope it with this drug that does this tiny thing in one of the parameters, what does it do? You can do that here.
May I ask something?
If this model, go ahead.
So, I mean, maybe the first set of parameters are very easy to interpret. What about this set of parameters that you found? Somehow, do they still have like are they easily identifiable with some aspect of the experiment?
Okay, so suppose I have a drug that takes KDB RAF, that particular rate constant, and change it by 50%. Then I look at all these parameters and say, which of these involve KDB RAF? And I can figure out how much they will change when I change that. And then I can make a prediction, which is not usually possible in black box things. The black boxes don't really understand what's going on inside them, and here they do. Is that what your question was?
Yeah, I mean, I'm somehow asking about that precisely, about how, if this is a black box or not, somehow. I mean, we can reduce parameters, but at the end, we want to understand somehow.
So I would claim that this is much more comprehensible than this was. So the understanding is very helpful. It's not to say this is truth. It could be that there's another microscopic model that leads to the same behavior of the experiments we have so far, which is different from this. But what I can say is this model fits the data as well as the original model. And so it's a good starting point for designing new experiments, because this is sort of equivalent to the original model in terms of our understanding of how much the existing experiments have led to predictions.
Yeah, okay, got it.
This ends me with big questions. Lots of science, engineering. I spent a lot of time thinking about plasticity in metals, where the engineers have perfectly good models that they fit to experiments, and then they design bridges and they design alloys and they fiddle with things, and the models are not based on fundamentals, and yet they capture enough about the real world that the low dimensional manifold of possible material behaviors is pretty well described by adding a damage parameter or a porosity parameter, even though when you look at the material with a microscope after you fit it, you can't find the same porosity or the same densities. You can use these ideas for developing better algorithms for optimization and control. There's a beautiful interpretation of the Levenberg-Marquardt algorithm for solving least squares problems in terms of geodesics. You can talk about things like in biology, there are neutral spaces. There's people talk about large number of neutral spaces and robustness, but robustness doesn't make sense in the sense that if all the parameters don't matter for the behavior, then how do you ever evolve if the way you evolve is changing the parameters of your problem? And sloppiness says most parameter combinations don't matter, but any parameter changing it will change the behavior, allows you to be both evolvable and maybe robust. Machine learning. You think 48 parameters is a lot, or even 1,000 parameters in a typical systems biology model these days. Machine learning has millions of parameters fit to data. And yet it works well. And it's incredibly sloppy, but maybe we can understand machine learning as the machine learns. Maybe it gets sloppier when it's dealing with real world data, and it gets stiffer when it is handed random data and things like that. And broadly speaking, apart from physics where we have small parameters, why is the world comprehensible? Why can we make predictions about climate when our understanding of clouds and glaciers and oceans is feeble enough that one would naively think that fitting the model to data would not be reliable, and yet we've learned to trust them out of experience more than fundamentals. Thank you very much.
Well, Jim, thank you very much for this fantastic talk. I have many questions, but before I ask you, maybe I'll allow the colleagues to ask questions. Please, colleagues, if you have any questions, unmute your microphone and ask directly. If you cannot do it for some technical reason, write something on the chat so I can read it. Please go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you for the very nice talk. It's very, very interesting. I had a question of in your slide of on the easing replicas. It seems that when you go to the replica, when you make the data go to zero, the convexity of the surface changes.
Yep.
Does it has to do with the fact that at that point it's unstable, the replica? I mean, maybe you're doing symmetry, replica symmetry or something, or it's totally something uncorrelated?
I would urge you to not spend too much time thinking about that manifold. This is the manifold that you get when you don't take a 4x4 Ising model, but take an infinite dimensional Ising model and find an isometric embedding.
All right.
Yeah, but
and this model, it also has weirdnesses, but it's I can tell you how to draw this picture just by knowing the magnetization and the energy is a function of temperature and field. This is very tangible, and I don't really see any bowing up or bowing down in it. Now, so the bowing up and bowing down is not a statement about the model manifold. It's a statement about either finite size Ising models, or it's a statement about which kind of isometric embedding you're using. And this is a much more powerful isometric embedding and doesn't show that funny curvature.
Okay, thank you.
But if I can add, I think that, and you correct me, Jim, if I'm mistaken, I think the reason of changing convexity is because in the replica limit, you have something which is always proportional to n times n-1 divided by n. When n goes to 0, there is a change in the behavior of.
It could easily be. Could
Yeah.
easily be. Yep. Could easily be. I'm not following your algebra, but I believe you. Yeah.
Very good. Yep. More questions? Well, if not, or while people think about questions, I have two questions. One is just a comparison of algorithms. This is a very fantastic algorithm that one of your colleagues was doing, the last one, to reduce the model. How does it compare to, for instance, normal PCA?
We use normal PCA all the time. And in fact, we think the reason that PCA works, principal component analysis, it just says take a data set, whatever it is, rotate it so that the long direction is in the x-axis and the next longest direction is the y-axis. Draw your plot. It's a great way of taking high dimensional data, which happens to form a hyperrhythm, and pulling out the right parts. That's absolutely what we do all the time. But in a sense, what we're saying is, at least in the framework of model predictions or experimental data that's a result of a model, we can explain why PCA works.
Okay, very good. And another
the
question.
Other thing I should mention is that this kind of embedding is a generalization of PCA, except that PCA, all the eigenvalues are positive, and here some of them are negative. Just for your view. Yeah.
Thanks. And the other question I have is kind of more, let me put it philosophical, so to speak, which is related to evolution. Think about, for instance, biochemical reactions. Okay, if you look at the biochemical reactions, normally they happen when a few substrates, no more than 3, they combine to give a few chemicals. Okay.
Products, yeah.
And if I were to write down general chemical reactions, normally you could have a large number of chemicals, combining each other to give a large number of chemicals. But it seems that evolution or biochemistry has evolved so that it is more efficient for a few components to combine, you know, that instead of having a lot of components to combine at the same time. So is this in the framework?
I'm not sure. It would be a very interesting point if we didn't have a simple explanation.
Mm-hmm.
But let me provide, for that particular point, let me provide possibly a simple explanation. That in gases, you know, you can write reactions for combustion. Combustion is a very messy process. You take gasoline, you light a match, and it blows up. And the process of that flame, or even candle flames, they produce sorts of various complicated things. But all the reactions that the chemists write are few body. Mm-hmm. Two things coming together and making one, or two things coming together and making three. And that's because it's dilute, because gases very rarely have 7 things coming together all at once. Usually everything is a small number of things. I think in solution, most of the thing is water. The chances of several molecules coming together to distances on the order of chemical bond length is very small. So that it's typical in a reaction rate that it's the product of the concentrations of all the reactants that gives you the rate. And if you get too many reactants, you don't have much of a rate.
Sure.
I would now you can effectively have bigger ones if you have, like, their biological systems have proteins that act as templates, that one thing will stick to it, another thing will stick to it, a third thing will stick to it, a fourth thing will stick to it, and then the 4 of them will glue themselves together into some composite object and fly away. And I've forgotten what they're called, but they're very clever, and they allow for the catalysis of reactions that would otherwise be very slow. But even those, if you didn't know that there was this template, you would think it's a 4-body interaction, but it's really a bunch of 2 bodies.
Thank you. Colleagues, any other question?
May I ask?
Please, go ahead, Carlos.
So somehow you showed that simple theories are natural to find in some sense.
Yep.
And I would like to know, so there's an easy mathematical question, answer to the question that I'm going to ask, but I would like to, like, a personal opinion. What do you think about fundamental theories in physics? Like, do they exist? Does it make any sense to look for them? Like a theory of everything?
So it's clear that high energy physicists have been doing really interesting science. Okay, that by going to higher energies and looking at the phenomena, they see beautiful emergent things. The more microscopic they get, the more beautiful. In condensed matter physics, we have the opposite point of view. As we get more fundamental, we get this ugly stuff that we call chemistry. That Schrödinger's equation is a mess. The behavior of molecules and all that stuff is just horrendously complicated. But the emergent behavior, when you get a bunch of molecules together into a gas or an insulator or a superfluid, has an elegant emergent theory where you throw away all those molecules and you come up with the Navier-Stokes equation or something like that. So the philosophy that all the condensed matter and the biologists and everyone else have been thinking about is that you want to look at the emergent theories. They're the beautiful and elegant ones, and it's a waste of time to get too microscopic. But the high energy people, for some reason, Schrodinger's equation is just the center of complexity, and everything else becomes beautiful and elegant. Now, it's possible that the high energy people wouldn't study it if it wasn't getting beautiful and elegant, but that doesn't change the fact that they found a lot of beautiful theories up there. Then there's a practical question. Everyone tells us that science is always paid off in the long run. And if we figured out the correct string theory of the universe, would it matter? And I have two answers to that. One is that string theory already matters in that it predicts a whole bunch of things, whether or not it's correct. It's telling us things about mathematics, it's telling us things about knot theory, it's telling us all kinds of things. You can call it mathematics, you can call it physics, but it's worth doing because it's fun, because it's beautiful, and because it teaches us things. The change in our lives, if M theory or string theory or whatever it is turns out to lead clearly to experimental predictions that are correct, it won't matter for day-to-day life. There will be never a time when we are able to make technological use of things that are happening on energy scales up there. That would be my personal theory. But you're not doing it so you can make better tractors. You're doing it because it's beautiful, and because it won't make better tractors because it's correct. It'll make better tractors because it's cool and interesting and tells us things about things we didn't expect. But it'll be like the space program making Tang. It's the reason that NASA claims we went to space is that we would have spin-offs like Tang, but it's not. But Tang wasn't why we went to space.
Thank you, Jim. Any other questions, colleagues? Well, if not, Jim, thank you very much for this fantastic talk. It was an honor to have you here.
You were a great audience. It was fun.
It was great. So can I ask the audience to unmute your microphones so we can applaud to Jim in the old-fashioned way. Thank you very much, Jim. Okay, guys, this is it for today. So next week we'll have another seminar. I think the next week is dimensional, if I recall correctly. So see you next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.